The biting wind of a Chicago Christmas Eve whipped against the heavy revolving doors of the Royal Plaza, carrying with it a flurry of snow and a man everyone inside would soon regret ignoring. Elijah Banks adjusted the collar of his wool coat, a garment that had seen better decades, and stepped out of the yellow taxi. The fabric was worn at the elbows, but he brushed the fresh snowflakes from the lapel with a gentle reverence. It was the last Christmas gift his late wife, Amelia, had given him 20 years ago. To Elijah, it was armor. To the world of the Royal Plaza, it was an admission of failure. He approached the entrance, his boots leaving wet, heavy prints on the pristine red carpet. The doorman, a tall man in a uniform that cost more than Elijah's entire outfit, hesitated. He looked past Elijah, scanning the driveway for a limousine or a luxury sedan, pretending not to see the elderly man standing in the cold. Elijah didn't scowl. He simply waited, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air, until the doorman finally sighed and pushed the brass handle with the bare minimum of effort required. Elijah nodded his thanks and pressed a $5 bill into the man's gloved hand. The doorman looked at the bill with mild surprise, then tucked it away without a word, his eyes already returning to the street in search of real guests. Inside, the lobby was a different world. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles, cinnamon, and expensive leather. A 20-foot Christmas tree dominated the center of the room, its golden lights reflecting off the marble floors, while a pianist in the corner played a soft, melancholic version of Silent Night. Elijah walked toward the coat check, moving slowly, feeling the ache of the winter chill in his joints. Around him, men in tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns glided by, their laughter ringing like crystal bells. They looked right through him. To them, he was part of the background scenery, as invisible as the velvet ropes or the potted poinsettias. He reached the coat check counter, rubbing his gloved hands together to chase away the numbness. The young woman behind the counter looked exhausted. Her name tag read Sarah, and a small, festive reindeer pin was crookedly attached to her vest. There were dark circles under her eyes, the kind that came from working double shifts, yet when she looked up and saw Elijah, her expression softened. She didn't see a nuisance. She saw a grandfather who had been left out in the cold. "Good evening, sir," Sarah said, her voice raspy but warm. She didn't ask for his ticket immediately. Instead, she reached under the counter and pulled out her own thermos. "You look frozen to the bone. I was just about to pour myself some tea, honey and lemon. Would you like a cup? It's not on the menu, but it'll warm you up faster than the champagne." Elijah paused, genuinely taken aback. In a night defined by icy indifference, this girl offered the only warmth he had felt since leaving his house. "I couldn't take your tea, my dear," he said, his voice deep and steady. "Please," she insisted, pouring the steaming liquid into a paper cup. "My shift doesn't end until midnight. I have plenty of caffeine to keep me going. You look like you need this more." Elijah accepted the cup. The heat radiated through the paper, thawing his frozen fingers. He took a sip, the sweetness of the honey cutting through the bitter cold that had settled in his chest. "Thank you, Sarah," he said softly. "You are working late for a holiday." "Medical bills don't take holidays, sir," she said with a faint, tired smile, taking his worn coat and hanging it with as much care as she gave the fur coats beside it. "My mom's surgery is next week. Every hour counts." She turned her back to arrange a ticket on a hanger. In that split second, Elijah reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out the invitation to the gala. Instead, he withdrew a crisp $100 bill and slid it silently under the saucer of the paper cup on the counter. It was a small gesture, a test of character that she had passed with flying colors. He picked up the tea, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just here to judge a boardroom of executives. He was here to see if anything in this building was worth saving. As he sips the tea, Elijah looks toward the glowing ballroom doors, whispering to himself, "Let's see if the masters of this house have half the heart of this servant." Before Elijah steps into that ballroom, if you're enjoying these details and rooting for him, please comment the number 8 below to let me know you are still here with us. And if you haven't joined our community yet, I highly recommend you subscribe to Black King and hit that notification bell right now. Your support is what allows us to keep creating these powerful, inspiring stories for you. Now let's open those doors and see what happens next. Inside the grand ballroom, The air smelled of expensive perfume, roast turkey, and the thick, suffocating scent of desperation masked by laughter. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a kaleidoscope of light onto the hundreds of guests mingling below. Waiters in white gloves navigated the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns like dancers, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, invisible engines keeping the machinery of the gala running. Elijah slipped into the room, standing quietly in the shadow of a massive marble pillar. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn suit jacket, his fingers brushing against the folded leather document holder. It contained the contract that would either save the Sterling Empire or bury it. He wasn't looking at the projection screens displaying soaring and largely fabricated financial projections. His eyes were fixed on the man standing near the ice sculpture, Preston Sterling. Preston, the CEO of the hour, looked like a man unraveling in slow motion. Despite the perfectly tailored Italian tuxedo and the blindingly white smile he flashed at investors, a sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. He checked his Rolex for the third time in a minute, then leaned in close to his attorney. "Where is he?" Preston hissed, his voice tight with panic. "The rep from Ebony Capital was supposed to be here at 7. If that silent partner doesn't sign the liquidity injection by midnight, the bank sees the assets tomorrow morning. I need that signature, or we are looking at Chapter 11 before the new year." "Relax, Preston," his wife Camilla murmured, drifting to his side with a glass of Pinot Noir in her hand. She was draped in gold silk that cost more than most people's cars, looking bored by the very event meant to save their livelihood. "They'll come. Nobody turns down a Sterling deal." She took a sip of wine, her eyes scanning the room not for friends, but for flaws. She criticized a woman's hemline here, a man's tie there, feeding her ego on the perceived shortcomings of others. Elijah watched from his vantage point. He saw how Preston snapped his fingers aggressively at a passing waiter to demand a refill, not even glancing at the young man's face. He saw the artificiality of their charm, the way it turned on and off like a light switch depending on the net worth of the person they were talking to. Camilla's scanning gaze finally landed on the periphery of the room, near the Christmas tree. She paused, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows knitting together in confusion, then disgust. She nudged Preston with her elbow. "Darling, look," she whispered, gesturing with her wine glass. "Security must be asleep. There's a janitor wandering around the VIP section. It's ruining the vibe." Preston followed her gaze. He saw an old black man in a dated, ill-fitting suit standing still amidst the swirling party, looking completely out of place. To Preston, Elijah wasn't a guest. He was a glitch in the perfect image he was trying to sell. The stress of the missing investor, the looming bankruptcy, and the heat of the room suddenly coalesced into a singular point of irritation. Preston's eyes narrow as he spots Elijah. His stress finds an easy target, and he decides to vent his frustration on that intruder. Preston moved through the crowd like a shark smelling blood, his polished shoes clicking aggressively on the marble floor as he closed in on Elijah. Guests instinctively parted ways, sensing the shift in the atmosphere from celebration to confrontation. Preston didn't see a human being when he looked at the elderly man admiring the ornaments. He saw a blemish on his perfect evening, a symbol of the poverty he despised and feared in equal measure. He stopped inches from Elijah, invading his personal space with practiced intimidation. He lowered his voice, keeping the venom just quiet enough to maintain a veneer of civility for the nearby investors. "Excuse me," Preston said, his tone dripping with fake politeness. "I think you're lost, old-timer. The staff break room is in the basement, next to the loading dock. You are disturbing my guests with whatever this look is." He flicked his eyes disdainfully over Elijah's vintage suit. Elijah turned slowly, his expression unreadable. He didn't step back. "I assure you, Mr. Sterling, I am exactly where I need to be," Elijah replied, his voice calm and grounded, contrasting sharply with Preston's frantic energy. He reached into his inner pocket, intending to produce the invitation and the contract that would explain everything. Preston let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Don't bother pulling out a sob story or a donation request. This is a $500 a plate charity gala, not a soup kitchen." "Security." He raised a hand to signal a guard. Just then, Sarah appeared from the kitchen doors, balancing a tray of empty champagne flutes. She froze when she saw the CEO cornering the kind old man from the lobby. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She needed this job desperately. The tips from tonight alone would cover her mother's medication for a month. But as she watched Preston loom over Elijah, something in her sparked. "Mr. Sterling, please." Sarah stepped forward, her voice shaking but audible. She placed herself slightly between the two men. "This gentleman he is a guest. I served him tea earlier in the lobby. He's waiting for someone." Preston spun around, his eyes wide with disbelief that a minimum-wage server dared to interrupt him. The stress of the missing silent partner and the looming bankruptcy finally snapped his patience. "You served him." Preston spat the words out. "Since when does a coat check girl authorize the guest list? Look at him. He's obviously a crasher you felt sorry for." "No sir, he—" "Shut up." Preston barked, loud enough that the jazz quartet faltered and stopped playing. Heads turned throughout the ballroom. "Get him out of my sight immediately. And as for you, if he isn't gone in 10 seconds, you're fired. On Christmas Eve. Do you hear me? Don't bother coming back for your shift tomorrow." Sarah's face went pale. Tears welled in her eyes, the threat of losing her livelihood crashing down on her. Before she could beg, Elijah stepped in front of her. He moved with a sudden, authoritative sharpness that made Preston flinch. "Do not speak to her like that," Elijah said, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with a power that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. It wasn't the voice of a janitor. It was the voice of a man who commanded boardrooms. The room goes silent. Preston's face turns red, his grip tightening on his full glass of red wine, his ego bruised by a nobody challenging him. If you believe that integrity is more important than money, please comment the number 8 below to show you stand with Elijah and Sarah. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Black King channel and turn on the notification bell. We are dedicated to bringing you stories that inspire and empower, and your support makes that possible. Now, let's see how Preston reacts to being challenged. The sound of the liquid splashing was sickeningly loud, silencing the jazz quartet and freezing the conversation of 200 guests in a single, horrified heartbeat. Time seemed to suspend in the grand ballroom of the Royal Plaza. Just moments before, Camilla had leaned over Preston's shoulder, her eyes gleaming with malice, and whispered loud enough for the inner circle to hear, "Oh dear, he looks thirsty. Maybe he needs a drink to wash down that attitude." Encouraged by his wife and blinded by his own rage, Preston had tipped his hand. The glass of expensive Pinot Noir didn't slip. It was poured. Deliberately. The dark red liquid cascaded down the front of Elijah's chest, soaking into the gray wool of the vintage suit. To the onlookers, it was just a stain on an old jacket. But to Elijah, it felt like a physical blow. The wine seeped into the fabric that his wife, Amelia, had picked out for him 2 decades ago, the suit he wore to feel her presence on lonely holidays. The stains spread like a fresh wound, dark and irreversible. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few people covered their mouths, but no one moved to help. The elite of Chicago stood frozen, watching the wealthy CEO humiliate an elderly man on Christmas Eve. Preston lowered the empty glass, a smug satisfaction curling his lip. He felt powerful again, having exerted dominance over the only person in the room he felt was beneath him. "Consider that a cleaning fee," Preston sneered, his voice echoing in the dead silence. "Now get out before I call security to drag you out by your collar. You're ruining the aesthetic." Sarah let out a choked sob, her hands flying to her mouth. She started to rush forward with a napkin, but Elijah raised a hand gently to stop her. He didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a fist. Standing there, dripping with wine, Elijah Banks looked taller than anyone else in the room. He reached into his pocket and produced a simple white handkerchief. With heartbreaking dignity, he dabbed at the lapel, not trying to clean it, but acknowledging the damage. He looked up, locking eyes with Preston. The calmness in Elijah's gaze was terrifying. It wasn't the look of a victim. It was the look of a judge delivering a verdict. "You worry about the aesthetic of your party, Mr. Sterling," Elijah said, his voice soft but carrying to the back of the room. "But you just ruined the only thing in this room that money cannot buy, integrity. This suit can be cleaned. Your character cannot." He turned to Sarah, who was openly weeping now, terrified for him and for her job. Elijah offered her a small, sad smile. "Do not weep for me, child," he said kindly. "Weep for them." Elijah turned his back on the stunned room and walked toward the exit with his head high, while a few guests quietly pull out their phones to record the aftermath. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind Elijah, cutting off the warmth of the gala and returning him to the honest cold of the winter night. The silence outside was a welcome relief from the toxicity he had just left behind. Snowflakes settled on his shoulders, mingling with the dark red stain on his chest, but Elijah didn't shiver. The cold didn't bother him anymore. His resolve burned too hot. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Earlier, Preston had mocked him for reaching for it, assuming he was looking for a handout. Now, Elijah dialed a number that only a handful of people in the financial world possessed, the direct line to the chief legal officer of Ebony Capital. "It's Banks," Elijah said, his voice calm but absolute. "I've seen enough. Terminate the Sterling deal. Immediately." "Sir." The voice on the other end sounded confused. "The contracts are ready. You're at the venue, aren't you?" "I am leaving the venue," Elijah replied, glancing back at the glowing windows of the hotel. "The CEO lacks the moral compass required to manage my funds. Pull the offer. And send a notification to the board of directors explaining exactly why." He hung up and walked toward the valet stand, not looking back. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere was trying to recover. The jazz band had started playing a nervous, upbeat tune to drown out the awkwardness. Preston was laughing too loudly near the bar, trying to spin the narrative. "Just a senile old crasher," he told a group of investors, waving a fresh glass of wine. "Had to be done. Security these days is a joke, right?" Suddenly, the giant projector screen behind the stage, which had been displaying the Sterling and Partners logo, flickered violently. The music cut out as a sharp digital alert chimed through the room's audio system. A breaking news banner flashed across the screen, followed by the sleek, black and gold logo of Ebony Capital. Preston frowned, confused. "What is this? Who is touching the AV system?" His pocket vibrated. Then again. And again. Around the room, a wave of digital chimes erupted as 200 smartphones lit up simultaneously with news alerts. A board member named Marcus, whose face had gone pale as a sheet, rushed through the crowd, shoving guests aside. "Preston," Marcus gasped, holding up his tablet with trembling hands. "The silent partner, he just pulled the $800 million package. The deal is dead." "What?" Preston dropped his smile. "That's impossible. He hasn't even arrived yet." "He was here," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "We just got the memo. The chairman of Ebony Capital stated he was assaulted and humiliated by the CEO less than 5 minutes ago." Preston froze. A cold knot formed in his stomach. "Assaulted? I didn't assault anyone. I just..." His voice trailed off as the image on the giant projector screen changed. It was a profile photo of the chairman of Ebony Capital. The man was younger in the photo, but the eyes were unmistakable. The dignified posture was the same. It was the man in the vintage wool suit. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Camilla covered her mouth, her eyes widening in horror as she realized she had just mocked the man who owned their debt. Preston drops his empty wine glass. It shatters on the floor, echoing the sound of his future breaking into pieces. The snow had begun to fall harder, covering Chicago in a blanket of white, as if nature was trying to cleanse the stain of the evening. Outside the hotel entrance, the wind howled, biting through the thin fabric of evening gowns and tuxedos, but Preston and Camilla didn't feel the cold. They felt the suffocating grip of ruin. They burst through the revolving doors, stumbling onto the icy pavement without their coats. Preston looked wild, his hair disheveled, scanning the line of departing vehicles. He spotted Elijah standing by the curb, about to step into a waiting yellow taxi. The man who held their fate in his hands looked calm, a solitary figure against the swirling snow. "Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks, wait." Preston screamed, sprinting across the slippery driveway. Camilla followed, her heels clicking frantically on the ice, clutching her bare arms. "Please. We didn't know. It was a terrible mistake." Elijah paused with one hand on the car door. He turned slowly. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked disappointed. Preston skidded to a halt, breathless, his face pale. "Sir, please reconsider. If you pull the funding, we lose everything. The company, the house, everything. We didn't know it was you. If we had known." "That is exactly the point, isn't it?" Elijah interrupted, his voice cutting through the wind. He rolled down the window halfway as he sat inside the warm cab. "It wasn't a mistake, Preston. It was a choice. You chose cruelty when you thought no one was watching. You chose to humiliate a man because you thought he had no power. My money is for building futures, not funding bullies. We can change." Camilla pleaded, tears freezing on her cheeks. "We can issue a public apology." "Apologies change words," Elijah said softly. "Actions change character. You have a long road ahead of you." He signaled the driver to wait a moment longer. He turned to the doorman, the same one who had judged him earlier but had accepted his tip. The doorman now looked at Elijah with wide-eyed respect. Elijah handed the doorman a thick, cream-colored envelope. "Give this to the young lady at the coat check. Sarah. Tell her it's for her mother's surgery and her tuition." The doorman nodded vigorously. "I will, sir. I promise." At that moment, the hotel doors opened again, and Sarah ran out, clutching her shawl. She had heard the commotion. The doorman immediately handed her the envelope. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000 and a handwritten note on a napkin. "Integrity is the best currency. Never change." Sarah looked up, gasping, tears of pure joy streaming down her face. She tried to shout a thank you, but her voice broke with emotion. Elijah simply raised a hand in a silent farewell from behind the glass. Preston and Camilla stood frozen on the sidewalk, shivering violently as the reality of their new life settled in. The elite guests inside watched from the warm windows, but no one came out to offer them a coat. The taxi disappears into the snowy night, leaving Preston and Camilla standing in the freezing cold, ignored by the very world they tried so hard to impress.